Let's take a look at macroevolution on its greatest scale. So in a previous video, we talked about Carolus Linnaeus's two-kingdom system and the classification system that he gave us based on categorizing organisms with similar characteristics. Now, there was one major problem with his system, and that was that it didn't account for bacteria. The reason was that he didn't know they existed, most likely, or even if he did, he maybe didn't think that they were important enough to include, or maybe he didn't consider them living. I don't know. But with the development of microscopes and much better magnification capabilities, actually, he didn't have microscopes. Thinking about the timeline, he didn't have microscopes. Microscopes came about in the mid-1800s or so. And there wasn't really a great understanding of single-celled organisms until the early 19th century-ish. So Linnaeus's kingdom system had to be refined, and in the 1960s, biologists adapted a five-kingdom system. Now, this one had some problems as well. We'll talk about in just a minute. This five-kingdom system grouped all bacteria, all microbes into one kingdom, and eukaryotes into four kingdoms. The problem with this was that in the 1970s, we discovered a new group of bacteria-like organisms. So now we have a new kingdom. And we also discovered that one of the eukaryotic kingdoms, the protists, actually was not monophyletic. It was there were protists in all of the animal, plant, and fungi groups. And so that classification system was scrapped. And a man named Carl Woese started looking at ribosomal RNA. I'll come back to ribosomal RNA in just a minute, but based on DNA sequence information, we have this new revised classification system. In this classification system, we have two prokaryotic kingdoms, bacteria and archaea, and then we have one big eukaryotic kingdom that consists of eukaryotic domain that still consists of four kingdoms, but we've divided the protists up and put them in different places. So Carl Woese used ribosomal RNA because ribosomal RNA is a section of genetic information that is very highly conserved. So that means that all living organisms have it and its sequence is very similar, particularly in each of the three domains. Now, ribosomal RNA is the gene, it comes from the DNA gene that codes for RNA that is part of the ribosome. Now remember that the ribosome is our protein factory, so this is a really important gene. If you don't have functional ribosomal RNA genes, you can't make any proteins, so there's no possibility for you to survive. So ribosomal RNA is very, very consistent throughout living organisms, and it can only tolerate very few changes before it changes too much. So based on our RNA sequences, Carl Woese and his colleagues discovered that bacteria were much more diverse than we knew about, and he discovered another group. He discovered the archaea group. Now, based on our RNA sequences, he hypothesized that the archaea groups were actually more closely related to eukaryotes than to other bacteria, and that the archaea and the eukaryotic groups share a common ancestor. The common ancestor with bacteria is a little bit farther back. Now, the implication for this, or the interpretation of this, is that the original precursor eukaryotic cell was very likely an archaea. Now, if you remember from chapter 4, we talked about the endosymbiont theory, or endosymbiosis, which was the theory that explained how we got eukaryotic cells. The explanation for this is that an archaea engulfed a bacteria, and that bacteria became our mitochondria in the eukaryotic line. So at this point, one archaea species would have engulfed what would become our organelles. The other branch would have continued on being single cellular archaea line. Back here we have a common ancestor that would have split into the bacteria line and to the archaeal line. And then from there, based on more DNA sequencing, we were able to split the kingdom Eukarya a little bit better. So some of the protists are actually categorized more similarly to animals, some are more similar to plants, and then some have a greater common ancestor. So protists cause a bit of a problem with this because originally they were sort of categorized in with whatever they looked like. So the ones that were more similar to plants were just considered plants, the ones that were more similar to animals, but it turns out they are actually their own kingdoms, but they're not monophyletic. Not all of these protists are actually more closely related to one another. Some of them are more closely related to plants or other animals. So let's talk about these three big domains. We're going to talk about them very, very briefly. There's more information in our book on all three of these if you're particularly interested, just not in this chapter. So the bacteria domain consists of all single-celled prokaryotic organisms. They all reproduce asexually, which causes some problems with our biological species concept. It's harder to separate them when you can't tell who they can breed with. But the problem is that bacteria don't breed with one another. So bacteria are often characterized by their physical appearance. There are some very distinct types of bacteria, just like there are distinct types of plants or distinct types of animals. And they can be classified by their physical characteristics. They are often first categorized by the type of cell wall on the outside, and then further characterized by some other specific characteristics. They can also be divided based on their genetic sequences. So very often bacterial trees are done using specific genes like ribosomal RNA. So bacteria often get a bad rap because the ones that we're most familiar with are those that cause disease. For example, this is E. coli, and E. coli is the bacteria that gives us food poisoning, essentially. If you eat some bad lettuce at Taco Bell, you're going to get sick, and it is caused by E. coli. There's lots of other illnesses that come from this, bacterial pneumonia, different types of infections, things like that are all caused by bacteria. But actually bacteria are really sort of our prokaryotic friends. A vast percentage of them are actually essential to our lives, or at least not particularly harmful or don't even bother us. So that same E. coli that causes you to get sick if you eat bad lettuce from Taco Bell actually resides in most of our guts, along with a whole host of other gut bacteria. And these guys help us break down some of our food. They produce essential vitamins for us, and some other nutrients that are really important and are actually pretty important in maintaining the overall health of our digestive system. Some other important ones are decomposers. If we didn't have bacteria chewing up dead grass and leaves and other dead organisms and breaking them down, all of the dead stuff on Earth would just pile up, and we wouldn't be able to live. So even though people are like, oh, bacteria are so gross, most of them are not harmful at all, and are actually quite beneficial. Bacteria occupy almost every single ecological niche on our planet. So pretty much bacteria can live in almost any place. The places that bacteria can't live, though, are often occupied by the archaea domain. So archaea are characterized by the ability to live in extreme environments. And although they don't have to live in those extreme environments, some of them, they occupy the locations that bacteria do not. So think super hot springs, really salty lakes, high and low pH areas, high pressure areas. Some archaea are methanogens, which means they get most of their food energy from methane, or they break down carbon molecules and release methane. These guys are very prevalent in cow guts, and they help the cows to break down their food. So they occupy a variety of places that other organisms cannot. They are they are different from bacteria in the sense that they have a cell wall that contains some specific sugars that bacteria do not. And so that's sort of how one of the ways that we can distinguish bacteria from archaea. And then of course they are our more closely related single-celled ancestor, but this ancestor would have been millions and millions and millions of years ago, a very long time ago. But we are more closely related to them than to bacteria. And then finally, our favorite domain, the eukarya domain. Most people are familiar with this. You walk outside, you see eukaryotic organisms, all the plants you see, all the animals you see, all the weird fungus that grows in the forest, all of that is the eukaryotic domain. And I'm not going to say too much about them here. The eukaryotic domain is generally classified or broken down by the way that the organism consumes their nutrients. So if you are an animal, you consume nutrients by eating other animals or eating other plants. You have to get your nutrients from other living organisms. If you're a plant, you get your nutrients from the sun. So you are able to take in sunlight and convert it into carbohydrate energy and then utilize that own energy, or other living organisms can eat you and take your hard-earned sunlight energy as well. And then our fungi are also really important decomposers. So fungi get their energy by consuming other living organisms, but they do it by basically secreting enzymes that break it down on the outside and then absorbing it. So we consume our food, we break it down on the inside. Molds and fungus and things like that secrete enzymes and then absorb all of those nutrients. The reason that we're most familiar with eukaryotes is that we can see them all the time, and they are the most of our named species come from the eukaryotic group because they're what people are interested in, and they are named because people have been studying them for so long. But there are millions and millions more species of bacteria and archaea than we will ever have of eukaryotes. So if we look back at that domain, the tree of life, there are many kingdoms within bacteria and archaea, and the number of kingdoms within eukarya is so much smaller than the rest of the organisms that live on Earth. Most eukaryotes are multicellular, but there are quite a few protists. So remember, protists are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. Some of them sort of act like animals, like amoeba or paramecium. These are little pond organisms that swim around and consume prey items. Some of them are more similar to plants. So algae are more similar to plants, but they are single-celled. They are not plants. They are single-celled eukaryotes that can also perform photosynthesis.